February 21st, 1945, Iwo Jima, Pacific Ocean. The island burned beneath a gray sky. Smoke curled upward from shattered pillboxes and molten sand. The air was heavy with gunpowder and the faint metallic taste of blood. Inside a hidden Japanese bunker, Lieutenant Hiroshi Takamura pressed his field binoculars against the narrow observation slit. Outside, across the devastated beach, American Marines were advancing, slowly, methodically, through a storm of fire. But what unsettled him wasn't their firepower. It was their faces. Through the haze, he saw you soldiers moving between craters, grinning, shouting to each other over the roar of mortar. One Marine laughed as he ducked behind a burning tank. Another handed out cigarettes while shells exploded just meters away. Their helmets were smeared with sand, their uniforms torn, yet they looked alive. Takamura lowered his binoculars. In his training, fearlessness meant silence, obedience, and readiness to die. But this strange, smiling courage defied everything he understood about battle. He whispered to his aide, "They fight like men who already know they'll live." Outside, the laughter carried faintly through the smoke. And for the first time, the Japanese officer felt something he had never known before. Confusion to understand why that moment on Iwo Jima unsettled Lieutenant Takamura so deeply. We must go back to the roots of how two empires taught their men to fight and what they believed. Courage truly meant in the 1930s. The Imperial Japanese Army was molded by a philosophy older than the nation itself, Bushidō, the way of the warrior. It was not just military doctrine. It was moral law. Soldiers were taught that death was not to be feared, that surrender was dishonor, and that dying in battle for the emperor was the purest form of loyalty. In training camps across Japan, instructors drilled these ideas relentlessly. Recruits bowed before portraits of Emperor Hirohito each morning, recited oaths of devotion, and marched until their legs trembled by the time Japan's war machine reached full power in the late 1930s. During campaigns in China and Manchuria, its soldiers were seen as unbreakable. They were trained to suppress emotion, to endure pain, to fight without hesitation. Even wounded men often refused medical evacuation. Death was a privilege. Survival, a burden. When Japan launched its surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, this spirit surged with national pride. Across the Pacific, Japanese commanders believed that the Americans, soft, individualistic, pleasure-loving, would crumble quickly. Newspapers in Tokyo called Americans weak-willed, spoiled by freedom, and lacking the warrior's heart. But the Americans who landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942 were not the men Japanese officers expected. They were farm boys, factory workers, and college athletes. Many had never seen the ocean before, let alone war. Yet when they were thrown into the jungles of the Solomon Islands, their reaction to terror was startlingly human and unexpectedly powerful. They cursed. They joked. They fought through exhaustion by leaning on humor, not silence. A captured Japanese diary from the battle recorded a strange observation. The enemy shouts and laughs in the midst of combat. They carry photographs of women and speak of returning home. We do not understand this behavior. It was a glimpse into the cultural gulf that defined the Pacific War. To Japanese officers, the American soldiers' ease with laughter under fire seemed like madness. To Americans, it was how they survived. The U.S. military's philosophy of morale was built not on sacrifice for a divine emperor, but on belief in comradeship and purpose. Generals like George C. Marshall and Holland Smith emphasized unit cohesion, the idea that men fought not for abstract ideals, but for the Marine or soldier beside them. Back home, American society flooded the war effort with personal connection, letters, photographs, radio messages. Soldiers were encouraged to write home daily, to listen to swing music, to remember life beyond the battlefield. Psychologists within the War Department even studied ways to maintain humor and identity under stress. The result was an army that fought fiercely, but without losing its humanity. By 1943, this psychological divide was becoming clear in the Pacific. Japanese garrisons fought to the death in places like Tarawa and New Guinea, launching suicidal banzai charges rather than surrendering. American troops, on the other hand, dug in, adapted, and endured. Their humor became a weapon, a shield against despair. At Tarawa, a Marine was heard saying, "If the Japs see me smiling, they'll think I'm crazy, and maybe I am." His platoon laughed. Moments before they charged across the lagoon. To the watching Japanese, such behavior was incomprehensible. To the Americans, it was the only way to stay sane in a world gone mad. By 1944, as the tide of war turned, Japanese officers began documenting these strange habits. Reports described American soldiers who shared food with prisoners, who buried enemy dead respectfully, and who fought with an optimism that seemed unshakable. One intelligence officer wrote bitterly, "They laugh because they believe their factories will never stop. Their smiles are weapons of arrogance." But those smiles, that seemingly casual defiance, came not from arrogance, but from something else entirely: resilience. The Americans had learned how to turn fear into familiarity. Every joke in a foxhole, every smile before a charge, was a rebellion against death itself. By early 1945, as the Americans closed in on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the Japanese high command was deeply unsettled. How could an enemy that joked amid gunfire, that played baseball between bombardments, that smiled while advancing through hell, possibly be defeated by men who had forgotten how to live? The answer would come soon, on the black volcanic sands of Iwo Jima, where laughter met the Bushidō, code head -on. By the beginning of 1945, Japan was fighting a war it could no longer win, but few within its military dared to admit it. The empire's outer defenses had crumbled. Saipan, Guam, and the Philippines had fallen. The imperial navy, once a symbol of might, lay crippled beneath the Pacific. And yet, the Bushidō spirit demanded perseverance, even in certain defeat. On the volcanic island of Iwo Jima, only 21 square kilometers of barren rock, the Japanese prepared to make their stand. General Tadamichi Kiribayashi, commander of the garrison, was a man of intelligence and discipline. He had studied in America years earlier, at Harvard and as a military attaché in Washington. He knew his enemy well and respected their industrial power. But his officers, many molded by the fanaticism of Tokyo's military academies, could not understand the American psychology. Kiribayashi wrote in one of his final letters, "The enemy is strong not because they do not fear death, but because they cherish life." That insight, however, would be lost amid the growing desperation. Beneath Iwo Jima's surface, thousands of Japanese troops dug an underground fortress to 11 miles of tunnels, artillery positions, hospitals, and command centers. They prepared to die, not to hold. Kiribayashi's orders were clear. There would be no banzai charges. Every man would fight from concealment, lead the Americans, and die at his post. When the U.S. Marines landed on February 19, 1945, they were met not by a visible enemy, but by silence, and then by fire. Machine guns tore through the first waves. Mortar struck the beach with deadly precision. From his command bunker, Lieutenant Hiroshi Takamura, an artillery observer from the 145th Regiment, watched through his periscope as hundreds of Americans fell. He noted their efficiency under chaos, how they pulled the wounded to safety, how officers calmly shouted orders through the smoke. And then, between the explosions, He saw something his doctrine had never prepared him for. Marines joking with each other as they crawled forward, laughing at their own luck, slapping helmets, sharing canteens. He couldn't comprehend it. To him, laughter was a breach of discipline, a symptom of carelessness. Yet these men seemed to fight better because of it. Later that night, Takamura recorded his thoughts in a small field notebook. The enemy soldiers show strange spirit. They die easily but do not appear afraid. Some even smiled before falling. Their laughter echoes through the smoke. Perhaps they are not human. To the Japanese, this emotional display was alien. In their training, emotion was weakness, suppressed through ritual and obedience. The Americans, however, were taught that emotion was human, and humanity could be a weapon. U.S. forces at Iwo Jima fought not as individuals seeking glory, but as teams bound by humor and trust. One Marine captain described it best in a post-war interview. You'd hear a guy crack a joke about dinner while shells were landing around us. Somehow, that made us remember what we were fighting for: home. Every laugh, every smile became a bridge back to the world they missed, a defiance of fear itself. As the battle dragged on, Japanese observers continued to misinterpret this behavior. Some believed the Americans were mocking them. Others thought it was a psychological trick. But as days turned into weeks, and Kurabayashi's forces were gradually annihilated, the surviving officers began to see something different. They saw men who refused to surrender, not because they sought death, but because they still believed in life. Reports recovered after the war reveal the shock in Japanese communications. The American does not pray before he fights. He laughs. Even when wounded, they sing. They fear nothing, not because they are divine, but because they are free. That word, free, carried a weight Japanese officers could scarcely understand in 1945. Their empire had built soldiers through obedience. America built them through conviction. By the time Iwo Jima fell, nearly 7,000 Americans were dead, and over 20,000 Japanese had perished, nearly to the last man. And yet, among the wreckage of Mount Suribashi, one image remained engraved in memory: Marines, smiling faintly as they raised their flag, covered in ash and blood, but unbroken. That image, captured by photographer Joe Rosenthal, would haunt Japanese officers long after the war ended. To them, that smile amid ruin wasn't arrogance. It was victory, the kind born from faith in something greater than the empty battlefield. When historians later dissected the Pacific War, they often focused on weapons, artillery, aircraft carriers, flamethrowers. But beneath the machinery of war, something more elusive shaped every battle: the human mind. No weapon fired faster, no engine ran longer than belief. And nowhere were those beliefs more different than between Japan and America. 1. The human angle. Emotion as armor. The Japanese Army's foundation rested on emotional suppression. A soldier's humanity was seen as a liability. From the moment of enlistment, recruits were broken down, physically beaten, starved, and humiliated, so that fear and self-preservation were erased. Pain was endurance training. Compassion was a distraction. By contrast, American boot camps taught something almost opposite. Discipline mattered, yes, but individuality was not destroyed. Soldiers were encouraged to maintain humor, to build camaraderie. Commanders understood that morale wasn't luxury. It was survival. Private E.B. Sledge, who fought at Pelileo and Okinawa, wrote, "We laughed at the absurdity of life and death because laughter was the only thing that kept us sane." That laughter, often mistaken for arrogance, was in fact a form of resilience, an unspoken pact among men that fear would not define them. Japanese observers, conditioned to equate emotion with weakness, could not comprehend it. Yet this emotional transparency made American troops adaptable, flexible, and psychologically durable through the worst horrors of war. 2. The cultural angle, death versus life. The Bushidō code taught that dying for one's emperor was the ultimate honor. For many Japanese soldiers, surrender was unthinkable, an eternal shame for themselves and their families. On Iwo Jima, nearly every Japanese defender chose death over capture. In contrast, American soldiers were taught that victory meant returning home. Their letters, their jokes, even their optimism were expressions of a deep cultural difference, one that prized living for something, not dying for it. In one captured report, a Japanese officer wrote, "The Americans laugh because they believe they will live to laugh again." That realization carried an undertone of tragedy. To the Japanese, life was already forfeited upon enlistment. To the Americans, every smile on the battlefield was an act of rebellion against despair, a declaration that survival itself was victory. 3. The tactical angle, adaptability, born of spirit. Morale wasn't just emotional, it shaped combat itself. American forces displayed a flexibility that stunned their Japanese counterparts. When ambushed, they improvised. When cut off, they regrouped. Marines cracked jokes while crawling through volcanic ash, and somehow it made them fight harder. Japanese doctrine, on the other hand, prized order and hierarchy. Soldiers awaited commands even under fire. Their bravery was unquestionable, but their rigidity often turned courage into futility. On Iwo Jima, U.S. Marines used humor tactically to calm nerves, to synchronize movement, to maintain rhythm under chaos. Veterans later recalled that shouting jokes between shell bursts helped squads stay coordinated, preventing panic. It wasn't comedy. It was control. 4. The leadership angle, two philosophies of command. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, an American Marine General Howland Mad Smith, embodied two worlds. Kuribayashi, though deeply loyal to Japan, had seen America's industrial might and human warmth firsthand. He knew the strength of free men. His letters home, now preserved in Japanese archives, are filled with quiet admiration for the American spirit. In one he confessed, "They are not machines. They are men who fight with hearts full of laughter and tears. That is why they are strong." Meanwhile, General Smith championed decentralized command. He trusted his officers, empowered his sergeants, and fostered autonomy. His Marines fought knowing their voices mattered, a concept unheard of in Japanese ranks. Where Japan's command demanded silence and sacrifice, America's command demanded initiative and belief. The result was a fighting force that could improvise, endure, and even smile in the face of hell, because they believed their choices mattered. 5. The psychological angle, the weapon of humor. Psychologists studying post-war records found a startling truth. Humor, not aggression, was one of the most consistent coping mechanisms among Allied troops. At Iwo Jima, some Marines nicknamed enemy bunkers after hometown diners. In Okinawa, soldiers carved jokes into helmets and rations. Even medics used laughter to distract the wounded during surgery. What the Japanese mistook for arrogance was in fact a survival instinct. Athe, former Imperial Navy lieutenant, later admitted during interrogation, "We thought they mocked death. Now I think they understood life better than we did." That understanding, the ability to stay human amid horror, became America's psychological advantage. It was why Japanese officers, steeped in centuries of martial stoicism, were truly shocked when they saw you soldiers fighting with smiles. They were witnessing a form of courage that didn't require silence or sacrifice, a courage born of freedom, fellowship, and faith that life had meaning beyond the battlefield. And yet, this cultural gulf would soon reach its breaking point. On the island of Okinawa, where both sides suffered unimaginable losses, the Japanese officers would confront a truth they had long denied. The Americans. Laughter was not mockery. It was power. As the Pacific War reached its final stages, the contrasts between Japanese and American soldiers deepened, not only in how they fought, but why they fought. Beneath the roar of artillery and the scream of dive bombers, an invisible war of morale was unfolding, one side fueled by obedience and sacrifice, the other by confidence and purpose. 6. The propaganda angle. The myth of the invincible soldier. Japanese propaganda painted a picture of the American soldier as lazy, materialistic, and morally weak. Leaflets dropped over islands mocked U.S. troops for their supposed fear of dying. Radio Tokyo described them as men who fight for money, not honor. But as battle reports filtered in from Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan, these assumptions crumbled. Captured diaries from Japanese officers show growing disbelief. They do not retreat when wounded. They joke even as they fall. It is not as we were told. Propaganda had promised that American men would collapse under hardship. Instead, their humor, teamwork, and sheer stubbornness revealed something terrifying to Japanese strategists, a new kind of warrior, one who did not fear death because he never expected it to define him. For many Japanese officers, this realization was profoundly unsettling. The enemy's strength wasn't in numbers or machines. It was in morale. And morale couldn't be bombed, burned, or starved. 7. The moral angle, humanity as a weapon. By 1945, the Pacific had become a graveyard. Every island was soaked in blood, and every victory came at a monstrous cost. Yet even in this chaos, small gestures stood out, gestures that defied hatred. American medics treated Japanese prisoners with the same care as their own. Chaplains buried enemy dead with prayers. Soldiers who had just survived ambushes still shared water with captured foes. To the Japanese, trained to see mercy as weakness, this was incomprehensible. To the Americans, it was duty, a reflection of something deeper than military discipline. War correspondent Ernie Pyle once wrote, "Our men could still laugh, still help each other, even after walking through hell." That is the difference between fighting for freedom and fighting for empire. This moral resilience unnerved Japanese officers. They were witnessing a philosophy of warfare that did not demand hatred to function. For the first time, they saw that empathy itself could be a weapon, one that no sword or machine gun could counter. 8. The psychological breakdown, the moment of realization as the battles dragged on. Captured Japanese soldiers began confessing to their captors, not out of fear, but confusion. They had been told Americans were weak. Yet the reality before them, men fighting, smiling, sharing cigarettes under fire, joking through terror, broke that illusion completely. One prisoner from Saipan told his interrogator, "We thought you were afraid to die. Now I see. You fight because you wish to live." In psychological warfare reports, Allied analysts noted how this reversal demoralized Japanese units. Soldiers who once idolized death now saw that their enemy's joy was more powerful than their sacrifice. It wasn't just bullets that won battles. It was belief. When American leaflets urged Japanese soldiers to surrender and live for peace, many laughed at first. But after seeing how their foes fought, human, defiant, alive, those same leaflets began to whisper something dangerous. What if life itself was honorable? 9. The leadership reflection. Kurabayashi's private doubts. General Tadamichi Kurabayashi, commander at Iwo Jima, was among the few Japanese officers who understood this early. Having lived in the United States before the war, he had seen American society up close. He knew their laughter was not weakness. It was unity. In one of his final letters, he wrote to his family, "The enemy is strong not because of weapons, but because of heart. Their laughter in war shamus our silence." Kurabayashi forbade senseless banzai charges, choosing instead a defensive strategy to honor his men's lives. Though doomed, his decision reflected an evolution, a recognition that blind sacrifice was no longer sustainable in a world where even enemies found strength in joy. For Japan's old guard, this was heresy. For Kuribayashi, it was Truth 1.10, the cultural aftershock, redefining honor when Japan surrendered in August 1945. Millions of soldiers returned home haunted, not only by defeat, but by what they had witnessed. American soldiers had fought fiercely, yes, but they had also laughed, cared, and forgiven. And somehow, that humanity had triumphed where fanatic devotion failed in post-war Japan. This realization became a quiet revolution. The Bushidō ideal of death before dishonor began to fade, replaced by a modern understanding. Honor could exist in survival, in rebuilding, in compassion. Former Japanese officers, reflecting decades later, often cited one image that stayed with them: American troops on a captured beach, smiling, helping wounded enemies, joking as they worked. They fought smiling, one veteran recalled. And in the end, it was their smile that won. That transformation, from confusion to understanding, marked the real end of the Pacific War. Not with the mushroom cloud, not with surrender documents, but with a human revelation. Laughter in the darkest hours can be the most unbreakable form of strength. Iwo Jima, February 19, 1945. The island was barely 8 square miles of volcanic ash. But to the men who landed there, it felt like the mouth of hell itself. From Mount Suribashi, Japanese observers watched as the first waves of American Marines stormed the black sand beaches under a storm of fire. Artillery thundered from hidden bunkers. Mortar erupted in clouds of ash and flesh. To the Japanese officers inside the caves, it looked like annihilation. They had prepared for months, building underground fortresses, tunnels, and killing zones. Every inch of that island was designed to devour invaders. And yet, something strange happened. Despite the slaughter, despite the heat, the noise, the chaos, the American soldiers were laughing. They laugh even when dying. Lieutenant Hiroshi Oda, stationed near the northern ridge, later wrote in his diary, recovered after the war, "We could not understand it. Their friends were dying beside them, yet they shouted and laughed. When shells fell close, they joked. When fire consumed them, they still sang." Through his binoculars, Oda saw Marines using their rifles as shovels when their entrenching tools broke. One man, covered in soot and blood, turned to another and said something that made both men laugh so hard they could barely reload to the Japanese command. It was madness. But to the Americans, it was survival. Humor, in that moment, was not defiance. It was control. It meant that even surrounded by death, they still owned their humanity. As the 5th Marine Division pushed inland, flamethrowers and demolitions cleared tunnels. Japanese soldiers emerged screaming, charging into the open. The Americans held firm, but even then, they called out jokes, cheering one another as if on a football field. The sound that haunted the tunnels inside the warren of tunnels below the island. The sound of American laughter drifted through cracks and vents. It became a haunting echo, bouncing through darkness and dust. For men trained to die silently, that sound felt almost supernatural, a reminder that the enemy above was not afraid. One Japanese soldier, later captured, recalled the effect. "We thought they must be ghosts. Only ghosts would laugh in such a place." General Kuribayashi, commanding from his underground headquarters, understood it differently. He knew American morale was unlike anything Japan had faced before. He had warned Tokyo, "These are not the same men you fought in 1942. He had seen it coming. But now, in Iwo Jima's volcanic nightmare, his prediction had materialized in full force. The Americans didn't just fight with weapons. They fought with spirit. The flag on Surabashan, February 23, 1945. 5 days after the landing, a patrol from the 28th Marines climbed Mount Surabaki. The mountain's slopes were riddled with Japanese resistance. Every step upward was death waiting as they neared the summit. The group's sergeant, Ernest Thomas, carried a small American flag. When the peak was secured, they raised it. For the men below, still pinned under gunfire, that flag rising through smoke and wind was more than a symbol. It was proof that hope was still alive. Cheers erupted across the beaches. Marines shouted, clapped, and whistled, even as bullets cracked around them. Many cried, others simply smiled and carried on fighting. Japanese observers, watching through periscopes, reported the moment to command. The enemy rejoices in the midst of fire. They are unlike any foe we have known. Kuribayashi, upon hearing the report, said quietly, "They fight smiling." That is their power. The laughter, the flag, the unbroken morale, it all carried deeper meaning. The Americans weren't fighting for conquest or empire. They were fighting to live, to go home, to see another sunrise. That belief, simple, human, and joyful, was the most unstoppable force on the island. Kurabayashi's realization, by early March, the Japanese defense was collapsing. Supplies were gone. Communications were shattered. Yet Kurabayashi refused to surrender. He wrote one final message before ordering his men into their last attack. "I have fought many Americans. I do not hate them. They are brave and good men. Their strength is not in their weapons, but in their hearts. Tell this to the future." That line, later recovered by Allied intelligence, was a rare confession from a general who had once believed in Japan's invincibility. When his final counterattack came on March 25th, it was brief, desperate, and doomed. By dawn, nearly all 21,000 Japanese defenders were dead. Only a few hundred were captured alive. But what stunned those survivors most was not defeat. It was how their captors behaved. The enemy who shared water. After the fighting ended, Marines searched the tunnels for survivors. When they found them, starving, bleeding, trembling, they offered water and food. They carried the wounded on stretchers, even when the prisoners could barely stand. One captured officer, stunned by the kindness, whispered through an interpreter, "Why do you not hate us?" The Marine replied simply, "War's over." No reason to. That moment, small, human, almost invisible in the scale of Iwo Jima, became the emotional pivot for many Japanese officers who survived. They had seen an enemy fight smiling, die with courage, and then forgive without hesitation. It shattered every illusion the Empire had built. By the time the American flag was raised again, the second, larger flag immortalized in Joe Rosenthal's photograph, even Tokyo's War Ministry received reports that morale among the Iwo Jima garrison had collapsed before defeat, broken not just by firepower, but by the Americans' unshakable spirit. That was the turning point, not just of a battle, but of belief. From that day, Japan's officers knew the war could no longer be won through willpower alone. March-June 1945, the Pacific Theater, the fall of Iwo Jima, sent ripples far beyond the island's black sands. Across the Pacific, from the Philippines to Okinawa, Japanese officers began receiving battlefield reports that were almost impossible to comprehend. The American advance had become unstoppable, not merely through technology or numbers, but through something deeper. They fought with an energy that defied exhaustion, with humor and horror, with smiles and chaos. And for the officers of the Imperial Japanese Army, trained from childhood to see war as solemn sacrifice, this was something alien, something that broke the logic of the Bushidō code. They fight like they already know they'll win. In April 1945, as the Battle of Okinawa began, Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, one of Japan's senior strategists on the island, wrote in his journal, "The Americans do not fear death, but they also do not seek it. They fight to live, not to die. This is the difference between us, and perhaps the reason we will lose." He had watched wave after wave of U.S. Marines and soldiers advance through minefields and artillery zones, not in rigid formation, but in fluid teams, laughing, yelling jokes, sharing candy with local Okinawan's in rare, quiet moments. That mixture of warmth and ferocity unnerved the defenders. To the Japanese mind, war was sacred duty, a funeral march in uniform. But to the Americans, it was a job to be done, and done together. Even under relentless kamikaze attacks and torrential rain, morale remained unbroken. In one diary captured near Naha, a Japanese officer wrote in disbelief, "Their planes burn, their ships sink, and yet they sing as they die. How can men who do not fear death also fearlessly enjoy life?" Captured officers' testimonies. By mid-1945, American intelligence began gathering testimonies from captured Japanese officers. What emerged was an unexpected theme. Admiration. One captured major from Saipan admitted during interrogation, "Your soldiers treat death like weather, unpleasant but inevitable. They do not worship it. That makes them stronger." Another, taken during the Philippines campaign, said quietly, "Our emperor teaches that dying is the highest honor. But your men, they find honor in surviving. I used to think that was cowardice. Now I see it as wisdom." Such reflections weren't isolated. They reflected a spreading realization. Japan's martial spirit, though fierce, had met its limit. America's strength wasn't born from fanaticism. It came from freedom, camaraderie, and a deep belief in returning home alive. That belief carried in laughter, in shared cigarettes, in smiling faces even under fire, became something Japanese officers could neither match nor explain away. The psychological collapse. By the summer of 1945, Japan's once unshakable command system was fracturing. Reports from the Pacific Islands arrived daily. Islands lost, fleets destroyed, airfields bombed. But the most alarming detail in those communiques wasn't about tanks or bombers. It was about attitude. Colonel Yahara noted grimly in a strategy memo sent to Tokyo, "We cannot win against a nation that finds strength in joy." Propaganda officers tried to counter this by framing American laughter as arrogance, the mocking of dying men. But soldiers on the front lines knew the truth. That laughter wasn't cruelty. It was courage made audible. As Japan's defensive perimeter shrank, so too did the myth of invincibility. Even within imperial headquarters, whispers spread. How? Do we fight an enemy who smiles while destroying us? The firebombing and the silence in March 1945, Tokyo itself became a battlefield. American B-29 bombers turned the night sky into a sea of fire. Over 100,000 civilians died in a single raid. The capital was reduced to ashes. And yet, among the wreckage, Japanese officers noticed something haunting in the enemy broadcasts and leaflets dropped from the skies. They didn't gloat. They didn't mock. They spoke of ending the war, of returning peace, of rebuilding what had been lost. It was the same paradox the officers had seen on the battlefield. An enemy capable of both immense destruction and immense compassion. The final realization. Defeat was cultural, not just military. By August 1945, when the bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan's war machine was already spiritually broken. Emperor Hirohito, in his unprecedented surrender broadcast, didn't speak of tactical loss. He spoke of enduring peace and the need to endure the unendurable. For men like Kobayashi, Ota, and Yahara, those who had watched Americans fight smiling, this surrender was the inevitable conclusion of something they had already witnessed months earlier on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, They had seen an army that turned suffering into laughter, fatigue into friendship, and fear into fuel. That was the moment the officers truly understood. Japan had never faced an enemy like this before. An army that didn't just fight for a flag, but for each other. In the burned ruins of Tokyo, surviving officers gathered for the post-war demobilization ceremony. Among them stood those who had fought on Iwo Jima. As the American occupation began, one of them, former Lieutenant Takamura, quietly watched U.S. Marines distribute food to Japanese children. He remembered the laughter on the beach, the smiles amid the smoke. And in that moment, he finally understood what it meant. The Americans hadn't fought smiling because they were unafraid of death. They had fought smiling because they still believed in life. September 1945, Tokyo Bay. The war that had consumed the Pacific was over. The Empire of Japan had surrendered. The once proud Imperial Navy stood silent, its ships now rusting under the gray sky as the stars and stripes fluttered over Tokyo. On the deck of the USS Missouri, Japanese officers, stiff, solemn, and broken, signed the instrument of surrender. Among them were men who had seen the Americans fight, not only with strength, but with something far more confusing, spirit. They remembered the laughter on Iwo Jima, the easy confidence at Okinawa, the quiet humanity that persisted even as their bombs fell. For many of those officers, that memory was far more haunting than the sound of gunfire. The American occupation begins when U.S. troops first landed in Japan. The nation expected humiliation. Propaganda had warned civilians that the American devils would slaughter and enslave. Families hid in fear. Soldiers prepared for imprisonment or execution. But then, the unthinkable happened. The Americans smiled. They handed out chocolate and canned milk. They helped rebuild bridges and hospitals. They shook hands with men who had tried to kill them months before. Japanese civilians stood speechless as these supposed monsters offered kindness instead of vengeance. A young officer from the defeated Imperial Army, Lieutenant Hiroshi Ito, later wrote in his diary, "I was ready to die for the Emperor, yet the Americans who should hate me offered cigarettes and food. Their laughter filled our ruined streets. I did not understand. I still do not." The post-war occupation was not merely a political process. It was psychological warfare of the most disarming kind. Every smile, every act of mercy, dismantled decades of indoctrination. The Japanese had been taught that honor was bound to death. Now, they were learning that survival could be just as honorable, perhaps even more. The transformation of the soldier's code, under the guidance of General Douglas MacArthur, Japan underwent a transformation unlike any in history. The once feared Imperial Army was dismantled. The Bushidō ethos that had glorified death was rewritten into something new, a code for peace, progress, and democracy. The same officers who once preached sacrifice began advocating education and rebuilding. War criminals who had commanded suicide charges now sat in classrooms, teaching about freedom and reconstruction. Yet, beneath this transformation lay something deeper, a quiet acknowledgement that Japan's defeat had not only been military, it had been moral. The Americans had won because they fought for life. They fought smiling because they believed in returning home. And that simple belief had proven more powerful than any empire. One Japanese general reportedly told an allied officer during questioning, "We lost because we fought with fear in our hearts. You fought with hope in yours." Cultural shock. The occupiers who healed in the months that followed, Japan cities slowly came back to life. American G's became familiar faces, teaching children baseball, repairing railways, sharing jokes through broken language. Photographs from 1946 show a surreal contrast. Smiling U.S. soldiers surrounded by children who had once been told to bite their tongues to avoid capture. Shops reopened. Jazz music filled the streets. and food distribution centers replaced bomb craters. For many Japanese officers, this peaceful reconstruction felt more surreal than the war itself. They had expected revenge and instead found respect. They had expected dominance and found compassion. Major Kenji Tanaka, who had fought at Okinawa, summed it up best in a 1947 interview. The Americans smiled while fighting, and now they smile while rebuilding. That smile destroyed our empire more completely than their bombs. The psychological legacy by 1948, Japan's collective memory of war had begun to shift. The once sacred concept of dying. For the emperor gave way to a new ideal living. For the future, the word shikata. Ganai, it can't be helped. At once justified fatalism began to take on new meaning, not resignation, but resilience. The same officers who had bowed to death now taught their children that the greatest strength lies in perseverance, not sacrifice. In quiet conversations between veterans, one realization echoed again and again. They smiled because they were free, and that freedom expressed not in cruelty, but in laughter, generosity, and brotherhood was the greatest weapon the Americans ever used. That shift from fear to understanding marked the true end of Japan's war. It was not signed in ink, nor written in surrender, but lived daily in the gentle exchanges between former enemies who now shared rebuilding a nation from ashes. Tokyo. 1949, 4 years after Japan's surrender. The sounds of war had been replaced by the hum of rebuilding. Factories that once forged bullets now produced bicycles. Fields that had been burned and cratered now grew rice again. The air that once carried the thunder of bombers now carried music. American jazz drifting through half-shattered windows. And yet, beneath this renewal, Japan was undergoing something far deeper than reconstruction. It was rebirth. From warriors to builders, many of Japan's former officers, stripped of rank and uniform, found themselves rebuilding the same cities they had once vowed to defend to the death. In doing so, they began to understand the strength that had once confused them, the strength they had seen in those smiling American soldiers. Men like Lieutenant Hiroshi Ito and Major Kenji Tanaka, who had fought on Saipan and Okinawa, became engineers, teachers, and community leaders. Their wartime experiences, once filled with bitterness, turned into lessons about perseverance and humility. Ito later wrote in his memoir, "When I saw Americans laughing in the midst of death, I thought they were mad. Now I see they were simply free. To build is harder than to destroy, but also greater." This shift became the quiet foundation of Japan's post-war miracle. The energy that had once fueled conquest was now redirected into creation. Factories roared to life not for war machines, but for cameras, radios, and cars. Within a decade, Japan would emerge as a global symbol of resilience. The philosophical shift, redefining strength before 1945. Japan's definition of strength was rooted in endurance, to suppress emotion, to sacrifice self, to die with dignity. After 1945, that definition changed forever. The American occupation didn't just disarm Japan's military. It dismantled an entire cultural philosophy built on suffering. The concept of Gaiman's silent perseverance remained, but it evolved. Strength was no longer the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. The smiling American soldier had shown something revolutionary, that courage could coexist with humor, that discipline didn't require cruelty, that victory didn't demand hatred. This idea, strange and foreign at first, began to influence Japan's young generation. Teachers replaced military slogans with words like peace, creativity, and hope. Former soldiers taught their students that strength wasn't about dying for your country. It was about living honorably within it. The U.S.-Japan relationship, from enemies to allies. By the early 1950s, the unthinkable had happened. The two nations that had fought the bloodiest Pacific War in history were now allies. When the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty was signed in 1951, many veterans stood in silence, unable to believe what they were witnessing. American troops, once occupiers, now stood shoulder to shoulder with Japanese officers, not as enemies, but as partners in rebuilding Asia's future. General Douglas MacArthur, who had once demanded Japan's unconditional surrender, now spoke of a partnership built on mutual respect. And remarkably, that respect was genuine. Japanese officers who had seen Americans fight smiling now worked alongside them in peace. They had learned that laughter was not defiance. It was resilience. Cultural echoes, from the battlefield to modern Japan. Psychological impact of those wartime encounters rippled through Japanese culture for generations. Filmmakers like Akira Kurosawa began exploring human complexity over blind duty. Writers and poets reflected on compassion as a form of courage. Even Japan's new self-defense forces, JSDF, established in 1954, were built on this philosophical evolution. Its guiding principle was not conquest, but protection, not dominance, but deterrence. Every salute, every uniform, every oath carried a subtle echo of the lesson learned from those smiling soldiers, that real strength comes not from cruelty or fear, but from the ability to endure with dignity and humanity. Legacy of a Smile. By the 1960s, as Japan rose from ruin to prosperity, many of its older officers passed away quietly, their memories fading into history. But among them were those who carried a single image to their final breath. American soldiers on a battlefield, covered in mud, smiling as they fought and rebuilt. It was an image that rewrote their understanding of courage forever. Lieutenant Ito, in one of his final letters before his death in 1968, wrote, "We learned that power without kindness is hollow. The Americans taught us that to laugh is not to mock death, it is to affirm life. Their laughter saved us from ourselves." That smile, once so bewildering to Japanese officers, became the quiet thread connecting two former enemies. It turned defeat into rebirth and humiliation into understanding. Through it, Japan discovered that peace could be as honorable as war, and that sometimes the greatest victory comes not from the sword, but from the human heart. The Pacific is calm now. Waves roll gently over the coral reefs that once burned under the fury of naval bombardment. Across those waters, time has softened the roar of war into the whisper of remembrance. 80 years have passed, and yet the lessons remain. When the Japanese officers first saw American soldiers fighting with laughter, they mistook it for arrogance. They couldn't comprehend how a man could smile in the face of death, how someone could carry humor into hell. But that smile, that small, human defiance, became the quiet bridge between two worlds. The meaning of strength history often measures strength by weapons, numbers, victories. But the deeper truth revealed itself not in the thunder of artillery, but in the calm after it. The Americans showed that strength was not just in muscle or steel. It was in spirit. It was in the ability to find light in darkness, to fight fiercely without surrendering compassion, to rebuild after destruction without losing faith in humanity. For the Japanese officers who witnessed it, this was a revelation greater than any military defeat. They had been taught that emotion was weakness, that laughter was indulgence, that the body must serve the emperor without hesitation. But in the end, it was the human heart, the ability to endure, forgive, and create that proved stronger than all the armies of the Pacific.Two nations. One humanity today, Japan and the United States stand not as enemies, but as allies bound by trade, trust, and technology. Their bond, forged in the fires of war, became a testament to the resilience of humanity. And yet, behind every handshake and every treaty lies the memory of that battlefield, of men who fought, suffered, and smiled through it all. Those smiles, once misunderstood, became symbols of endurance. Proof that courage and kindness can coexist. Proof that even in war, perhaps especially in war, the light of humanity never truly dies. A camera slowly pans across a black and white photograph. American and Japanese soldiers standing together in 1951, rebuilding what they once destroyed. No flags, no weapons, just men, tired, scarred, and smiling. Because sometimes history's greatest victory is not the triumph of one side over another, but the moment both sides learn what it truly means to be human.